I bought a ghost town on a frozen world for 70 credits, and found her. Welcome to Sci-Fi Nebula, where frontier stars meet human heart. Tonight, our signal rides a crosswind over a frozen colony world called Whitefall 3, where silence is thick as snowfall and old modules whisper with heat that should have gone out years ago. A drifter named Elias Boon lands with a deed he bought for 70 credits, a joke to everyone but him, only to find a widow and her 3 children still living inside the ghost town he thinks he owns. A storm is coming, and so is a man who believes people are just another kind of salvage. This is a story about how humans draw a line in the snow, not with bullets first, but with courage. About a woman who has kept the lights on with threadbare hands, and a man who thought he was passing through until the winter asked him who he stands with. Listen close. The wind on Whitefall likes to swallow voices. But some promises speak louder than weather. Chapter 1, Sky of Tin. The sky above Gale Cradle lay the dull color of tin, a low, metallic shroud pressing the world flat. When the shuttle's skids kissed the ice, Elias Boon felt the familiar thrum of the old lifters echo through the bones of the valley. The place had once been a mining cluster, a string of hab modules, a tool depot, a livery-turned-grav-sleigh hangar, a cracked thermal tower with an exhaust duct like a broken horn pointing at the clouds. Now it was a rumor, a ghost town left over when the ice sheet shifted and the company folded the map. Elias sealed his collar, stepped down, and the snow took him to the ankles with a sound like breath held too long. Whitefall did that. It laid a cold hand over the mouth of the world until even your own exhale seemed to belong to another time. He should have felt foolish about the deed. 70 credits at a liquidation auction, less than a good winter's fuel, a whole site deeded over because no one else could see use in skeletons. They had laughed when he raised his hand. Elias had never found laughter useful. He walked the main corridor that once pretended to be a street, the prefab shells leaning with snow on their shoulders. Frost ferns veined every viewport, doors hung canted on their hinges, and the wind prowled between units the way a stray dog learns alleys. He tucked gloved fingers into the inner pocket of his coat, tapped the fold of the paper there as if the deed could warm him back. That was when he noticed it, a thin ribbon of heat smoke unspooling in the air above the old boarding hab, the curl of vapor a careful hand tries to hide. Not wind, not residual. Alive. His boots squeaked on the ice as he climbed the steps. The stair treads groaned, the kind of groan metal makes when it remembers it was engineered by optimists. Elias lifted his knuckles to rap, but movement flashed in the viewport, a boy's face, lean and sharp-boned, then gone. He knocked once. The sound didn't travel. Whitefall disliked sharing. The door cracked open a hand's width. She stood there, tall enough to meet his gaze without tilt, hair tucked under a faded thermal scarf, coat elbows patched with care. The skin of her hands was crosshatched with winter's teeth, but her eyes were steady stone gray. Yes, she said. The word carried no welcome and no fear. Elias Boon, he said, tipping 2 fingers to the brim of a hat he no longer wore. Just come to take a look at what I bought. Not much of a town left, she said, and glanced past him at the empty corridor, measuring how alone he truly was. He let the quiet sit. Warmth brushed his cheek from the crack of the door, thin, careful warmth, the way you burn fuel when you have more night than fire. Saw your smoke, he said finally. Storm stacking over the western flats. You stocked to ride it? The boy he'd glimpsed appeared at her shoulder. Broad in frame for his age, jaw tight, eyes hollow from sleep you don't risk. We manage, the boy said. We've been managing a long time, the woman added, softer but firm. There was nothing in her voice that invited farther questions. Elias inclined his head. I'll be staying a bit. If the weather lets me. She hesitated like a woman weighing whether a door was a shield or a trap, then closed it, not a slam, just a careful drawing shut, as though the sound itself had a ration. He crossed to the hangar that used to serve as a livery, found one bay still half-sheltered under a sagging roof. His kit unfurled with a practiced economy, a thermal roll, a tool case, a net of spare seals, and a battered field welder that had outlived better stations. Through a warped seam in the wall he could see the boarding hab. Light sketched the moving shapes inside, a fire's amber bleeding faintly onto the snow like a memory not ready to die. An hour later, he heard something he had almost forgotten, the timbre of laughter. Thin, brief, gone, but clean enough to stop his hands. He sat with a strip of sealant poised between finger and thumb, listening the way you listen for the next breath after a birth or a blow. It didn't come again. At first light, frost filmed his roll in lace. He stepped into air that bit like iron and found the woman already outside, splitting polyfuel bricks into kindling with a hatchet too dull for the job. Her breath plumed white. The scarf had slipped, the wind teased a dark strand loose. On the porch, the boy stood sentry with his arms folded. Behind the glass, a girl on the cusp of womanhood, 15, maybe, arranged something on a table with a concentration that made even hunger look tidy. A younger boy pressed his palms to the viewport, brown eyes bright with a curiosity not yet taught to hide. When the hatchet bit and stuck, Elias crossed before he could choose not to. He freed the blade in one twist, then split the brick clean in 2 strokes. She didn't thank him. She studied his face like a map that might lie but still gets you out of a valley. "You planning to stay?" she asked. "Depends," he said, feeding another brick to the block. "Some places are worth the trouble." "This place isn't yours," the older boy said, voice thin with anger and something underneath it that might have been pride. "The storm doesn't care whose name is stamped on a deed," Elias said, and did not meet the boy's glare. "Some truths you say to the air, so no one has to lose." By noon, Elias had walked the length of Gale Cradle, peering into open mouths of modules where drifted snow lay waist deep. The thermal plant coughed like a smoker. The antenna mast showed hairline fractures. He counted salvage in his head, usable truss, intact brackets, copper worth something if there was anyone left to buy. Sensible plan, camp, strip, sell, gone before spring shift. But every time he passed the boarding hab, a wash of heat scent slid along the back of his throat, tea leaves in recycled water, yeast on a thin bread, and his gaze climbed to the curtained window where a small face sometimes appeared, watching, vanishing. Late afternoon brought the first fresh tracks from the south, 3 razor cuts across the snow that ended in a lazy loop before the family's door. Elias stood back in shadow, watching a man climb from a gravsleigh slick with iced dust. Tall. Coat too fine for the latitude. He knocked. Spoke. Elias saw the woman's shoulders stiffen. When the man left, he let his gaze flick to Elias and tucked a smirk under his cheek like a knife you keep handy. Word rode fast in places like this, especially on empty roads. A hidden family was a secret that paid. That night, the beams above Elias' head cracked softly as the temperature plunged, talking to the wind in the old language of stress. Somewhere beyond the hiss of snow on metal, he heard a sound like breath set to music. It took him a minute to realize the woman was singing. The melody thinned and went out. The questions did not. When he closed his eyes, he thought of the laughter, of a boy's sharp jaw, of a woman's hands raw with cold doing the arithmetic of survival at a kitchen table. He had come for lumber. The winter had offered him a different kind of math. Chapter 2, Warm Notes in a Cold Module. Morning arrived gray and windless, a lid pressed over the valley. Elias knocked, and this time the answer was the smell of heat and a room exhaling. He stepped into the boarding hab like a diver breaking the surface of a warm spring. The woman sat near the heater with a shirt in her lap, needle moving with the patient rhythm of someone who knows a stitch is not a miracle but sometimes imitates one. A chipped mug steamed beside her, tea that had given up its leaves days ago but kept pretending. The girl stood at a narrow counter, shaping yeast-thin dough into coins of bread. She lifted her lashes enough to offer him a small, apologetic smile, as if hospitality were a crime they'd all agreed to hide. "You're early," the woman said without looking up. "Light's short this time of year," he said. He scanned the walls, printed florals long faded, seams curling. The life of another family peeling free in the corners. He could feel the heat slipping away through a window latch that hung loose as a bad tooth. He crossed, lifted the sash, and reseated the hook with the point of his knife. The wood went with a tired sigh, but the latch held. "You'll lose less heat now," he said. "We didn't ask you to fix anything," the older boy snapped, coming in from the back with a rag in his fists. He looked at Elias like a man looks at a stranger near his fence. "Silas," the woman said. The needle paused, a line creased her brow. She looked at Elias properly for the first time. "Thank you." He set his hat on the chair by the heater, a ceremonial placing of a thing that would never get warm. "Wind's bringing more snow off the flats," he said. "You'll want that fuel stacked closer." "We keep it near the shed," she answered. "It's enough." He had seen the stack, a lean, slumped spine of polymer bricks and a dull hatchet hanging by its loop. Pride made a hard diet. He didn't argue. Hoofbeats didn't exist on Whitefall, but grav pads make their own crunch in snow when the skids bite, and by mid-morning Elias heard it. The door swung wide without a knock. A man in a fur-trimmed coat stepped in and shook glittering ice dust from his cuffs. His eyes took inventory of the woman in a glance that lingered like an unwelcome hand. "Well now," he drawled, the accent stretched to sound friendly to people it wasn't. "Didn't think anyone be fool enough to winter here." His gaze slid to Elias and creased with surprise. "And you are?" "Passing through," Elias said. "Funny thing," the man went on, smile deepening. "Talk says this hole got sold off for pocket change. Must have been one hell of a deal." Elias said nothing. He watched the woman's fingers whiten around the hem she was hemming. The man sniffed the air. "Beans and bread," he said. "Better than most got out on the lanes." His eyes moved to the younger boy peeking from the stair. "Cute kid. Bet he'd like candy next time I ride through." "Best keep your candy," Elias said, not moving. "Road slick this time of year." The man's smile twitched at the corner. He weighed the room, the heater's soft tick, the woman's stillness, the older boy's blade-sharp stare, the stranger by the window who didn't offer a name. Then he touched the brim of his hat to the woman and left the door ajar behind him like a hand he expected someone to take. Elias shut it. That afternoon, Elias hauled fuel from the windbreak grove beyond the modules, where spindly ice pines caught the worst of the drift. Jonah, the younger boy, trailed him half the walk, questions puffing in white bursts, about the shuttle, about rifles, about how far a man could ride if the trail held. Elias answered slow, the way you speak to skittish colts and children who watch your eyes for truth. By dusk, the stack was neat, the lane between hab and shed swept down to the ice. Lamps flickered life inside. Through the viewport, May leaned her chin on her hand and watched the snow fall orange in the lampglow. The smell of beans promised heat enough to be called a meal if you ate with people you loved. Eliza, he didn't know her name yet, but his mind had already stopped calling her the woman, filled 4 bowls, then made it 5 without looking at him. Elias took the seat nearest the wall, wrapped fingers around tin warm enough to sting, and let the quiet soak in. Jonah chewed loud enough to earn a nudge from May. Across from him, Silas watched his mother, watched Elias, watched the places between where decisions live. "You plan to stay long?" Silas asked finally. "Long enough to see what needs doing," Elias said. No one answered. But when the bread ran short, May slid half her coin to Jonah with a practiced flick like a magic trick that only works if you don't call it magic. Elias spent the night in the hangar again, but the wind shifted, shouldering warmth and something faintly sweet from the hab, sugar blooming in a pan, if memory could be trusted. In the small hours, he woke to the velvet hum of a single grav sleigh moving slow down the corridor. He rose, shrugged into his coat, and eased to the door. The rider passed, head turned toward the glow behind the curtains, the look lingering long enough to teach the dark a bad habit. Then the sound thinned and went away. He stood in the cold until he could not hear anything but his own heart. The boarding hab window glowed faintly, then a tall shadow moved, paused as if aware of eyes in the night, and drew the curtain. The amber went to a suggestion. Morning would bring more snow. And men who came for the kind of heat you can't buy. Chapter 3, The Trader in the Storm. The storm arrived like a held breath finally exhaled. First a restless brush of static against the windows, then a slow fat snow that turned to white roar, a sound you felt in your teeth. The thermal tower moaned, the antenna mast trembled like a tuning fork that had lost its note. By afternoon, the hangar roof began to bow. Elias stood under the sagging rib and watched powdered ice sift through seams like sand through fingers. He didn't wait for permission. He packed his roll, slung his tools, and crossed to the boarding hab in a crosswind that shoved hard enough to shorten a man's life. The door opened before he could knock. The woman's scarf was wet with melt, her breath white. "You're coming in," she said, voice brisk but eyes lingering half a beat. "Roof won't hold." "Wouldn't argue," he said, stepping inside as the wind tried to shoulder past him. Warmth wrapped him in a thin, careful layer. The heater ticked, the room smelled of iron, soap, and bread that had done its best. May, he had learned her name in the small currency of family talk, stood in a corner with a book. Jonah lay on a rag rug with a deck of cards bent into smiles from use. Silas stood at the window and watched the white erase the outside world a pane at a time. The woman set a chipped mug on the table near him. "Tea," she said. "Or what's left of it." "Thank you," he said. "Eliza," she said, as if tired of leaving that part unsaid. "Eliza Maye." "Elias Boon." "Silas," she added, nodding toward the window. "May." "Jonah." Names made a room different. They weighted the air. The wind worked every seam in the hab. Elias saw the worst of them in a minute and the rest in an hour. He taped, wedged, and welded, a small choreography of hands and patience. When the heater cycled hard enough to worry him, he rolled up his sleeves and pulled the panel. "She's overcompensating," he said. "We'll coax her through." "You talk to machines like they're old horses," Eliza said without looking from her stitching. "Old horses listen," he said. The day turned blue at the edges, the particular blue of storm afternoons on Whitefall. May hummed a few notes of a song and looked apologetic about it, then hummed more when Eliza joined, low and sure. The heater's voice softened. Jonah dealt Elias in without asking, and Elias lost just enough hands to keep the boy grinning. Silas dropped into a chair with the gracelessness of a young man carrying too much pride and not enough places to set it down. "What happens when the snow stops?" he said to his bull. "We keep on," Eliza said. "They won't," Silas said. "Men like him. They smelled this place. They'll come." Elias met the boy's eyes. "You planning to fight them all yourself?" "I'll do what I have to." "There's more than one way to win a standoff," Elias said. "First rule is choosing where the line actually is." Silas's jaw set. "What would you know about lines?" "Enough to still be breathing." The air shifted. Warm, but charged. Eliza's hand touched Silas's forearm, 2 fingers, a small persuasion. He eased back in his chair without surrendering the argument. Night pressed in early. The wind climbed the stovepipe and rattled it. Elias lay his roll along the inside wall and sharpened his hatchet by firelight, each pull on the stone a thought he didn't want to say out loud. Sometime after midnight, the storm dropped its pitch enough for other sounds to thread through. A soft, velvet hum, a single grav sleigh easing down the corridor. Elias rose, padded to the door, and lifted the edge of the curtain with 2 fingers. The sleigh slid past like a shark under thin ice. The rider's head turned toward the glow behind their curtains. No hurry. A surveyor savoring the map. Kade Mercer. Elias didn't need the name to know the type. He watched until the hum died beneath the storm and the only noise left was the house breathing. He stood there a moment longer, the back of his neck prickling in a way that had nothing to do with cold. Then he let the curtain fall. You saw him. Eliza's voice came from the table, quiet enough that it might not wake the house. He wants to believe we'll make it easy, Elias said. We won't, she said. He turned. In the lamplight her face was plain and bright and tired. We won't, he agreed. The storm pressed a hand over the roof and listened to what people said when they thought only weather was near. By morning the door would stick against drift. By midday the antenna would ice over and cry. And by evening, when the Habs lights painted the snow in honey, the storm would still be squatting on the valley like a big animal that had decided to winter where they lived. Get some sleep, Eliza said, and the way she said it made sleep a safe thing again. Elias lay down within reach of his tools. The heater exhaled. On the other side of the room, Eliza bent over a torn sleeve and stitched. For a breath or two, he let himself watch the careful pattern of her hands. Some storms outside were easier than storms people carried. He closed his eyes and listened for the creak of the stovepipe and the thread's small pull and the winter's old song. Outside, the snow erased every track but the one they were making in here. Chapter 4, 2 days out, 1 candle back. When the storm finally thinned to curtain instead of wall, the valley had a new shape. Drift shouldered most doors. The main corridor lay like a white ribbon pulled tight. The sky cleared into that pale, washed blue that promised cold without mercy. I'll ride to the waypost, Elias said at first light, strapping his kit across the sled. 2 days out, 2 back if the flats hold. Flour. Sugar. Seals. Candles. It's a long ride for one man, Eliza said, standing in the doorway with her hands tucked into her apron like she might hide the worry there. I've done longer, he said. He didn't say years' worth, across worse. He didn't say that leaving put a hard edge on his breath. Silas studied him like a test he hadn't agreed to take. May's mouth made the soft shape of candles, as if the word itself shed light. Jonah bounced on his toes and then pretended not to. Elias nodded once and kicked the sleigh into a low float. The skids hissed over the crusted snow. The white flats unrolled to a horizon that lied cheerfully about distance. He kept his pace steady, the way you do when the cold will tax mistakes with fingers. The waypost was a rust-streaked bubble of commerce holding on in a corner of the map companies had stopped funding but hadn't bothered to erase. The air inside carried the sweet sour of wet wool and stoves, the sound of voices that tried to be casual about hunger. He traded pelts and a spare rifle he'd meant to keep, watched the clerk weigh flour with the solemnity of a judge. As he waited, 2 men near the counter talked like men talk when they believe walls are friends. Boon, right? One said. Bought that dead patch of valley for 70. 70, the other said, delighted at the number. Word says a family squats there. Woman and 3 kids. Pretty thing, that one. Whitefall's full of bargains if you don't mind winter picking its teeth on you. The clerk tied the last sack with twine. Elias nodded his thanks without trusting his mouth. He packed flour, sugar, a coil of gasket, a sleeve of thermal candles. He hesitated over a jar at the end of the shelf, rock candy, bright like captured ice. He put it on the counter. For the kid, he said. The clerk's eyes softened, just a little. Long way to go, sweet, he said. Worth the wait, Elias said. The sky had slipped toward afternoon by the time Elias crossed back onto the flats. The cold reached into his coat and tested him. He rode with his jaw set against a muscle that wanted to climb. Night fell like a dropped curtain. He lit a running lamp and trusted the stars he couldn't quite see. Gale Cradle announced itself as a smudge of amber in the blue. Eliza was outside by the block, trying to split a stubborn polybrick with a dull hatchet. The hatchet stuck, bit shallow. She gripped the handle, the effort in her shoulders a line of pain. Elias eased the sleigh to a stop, stepped down, and took the handle from her without argument. He set the dull blade aside, swung his own hatchet twice, and the brick came apart with the sound of relief. You didn't have to, she said, rubbing her hands together against the cold. "I did," he said. Something unspoken stayed between them for a heartbeat, warmth that had nothing to do with the heater. Then she nodded and let him in. Inside, warmth made a soft shock. May and Jonah unpacked the sacks with the excitement of holiday. Flour and sugar went to the shelf. Seals and gaskets to the tools bin. Candles lined up in neat ranks like small, patient soldiers. Jonah's eyes went wide when the rock candy clicked into his palm. He looked at Elias as if the man had pulled color out of a white world. Silas kept to the corner with his arms folded, an old man's posture borrowed by a young body. When the meal was done and quiet had fallen between the ticks of the heater, he stepped out back. Elias followed into air that bit clean. "You can't keep doing this," Silas said without turning. "Fixing things. Bringing things. You'd rather I let the roof fall?" Elias said. "I'd rather we didn't owe anyone." Elias stared at the breath lifting from Silas's mouth and going to nothing. Pride looked a lot like fear if you turned it a quarter inch. "Not everything comes with a price you can measure," he said. "Some things, the counting makes them smaller." Silas didn't answer, but his shoulders moved like a decision had shifted half a degree. He went inside first. Eliza met Elias at the door with a small object cupped in her hand. She held it like light. "For your room," she said. In her palm, one of the biothermal candles sat, pale and perfect. "In case dark comes early." He took it the way you take a promise too new to carry hard. "Thank you," he said, and the words felt insufficient next to what sat in his hand. That night the wind edged up again, not a shout, just a voice outside the window. Elias set the candle on the table and lit it. Its small flame didn't so much burn as bloom. Across the room, Eliza mended a sleeve. In the wavering light, a silver thread in her hair caught and held. Later, when the children slept, Elias stepped outside. The corridor lay clean and white under the moon. Every old scar the town had worn was softened. He listened and heard only his own boots in snow and the small sounds a house makes when it's holding a family together. He turned back toward the door with the certainty of a man who had planned to leave and found himself plotting repairs instead. In the morning, they would raise the antenna and test the seals he'd brought. The day after, he'd show Jonah how to tie a safety loop that didn't slip and give May the radio schematics. He'd ask Silas to help brace the hangar roof because trusting a young man with something heavy often made both sturdier. And there would be time, maybe, to talk to Eliza without Winter listening in. He reached for the latch, and paused. Out beyond the far edge of town, 3 fine tracks stitched toward them across the flats, shallow and new. Grav pads had a way of writing intention into snow. Elias let the door close softly and leaned his back to it. Inside, the candle's flame stood steady, small and bright. He watched it for a count of 10, steadying his own. "Company," he said. Eliza looked up. She didn't ask who. The white world outside held its breath. The line they'd drawn would need to be walked. Again. Chapter 5, The Line. By evening the valley held its breath. Out on the flats, 3 fine cuts stitched toward Gale Cradle, new tracks, shallow and sure, the kind a confident hand makes. Elias watched from the hangar door as the last of the light went colorless and the wind scraped thin skeins of powder along the ice. He walked the corridor that had once pretended to be a street and felt the town's hollow ribs flex under the weather. The heater in the boarding hab ticked like a small, brave heart. Behind its windows, figures moved, Eliza's steady silhouette, May's narrower one crossing with a stack of plates, Jonah's round crown of hair, Silas's lean, bristled frame near the door. Elias set 2 reflector plates in the snow at knee height, a few paces ahead of where the grav pads would drift. He unspooled a coil of copper and clipped a pair of puck-sized devices to the plates' backs. The cold made his fingers slow. When he looked up, Eliza was standing in the doorway, cinching her scarf. "How long?" she asked. "Soon," he said. I'll stand with you. You already are. Silas stepped onto the porch and planted his boots aboard behind his mother's. May appeared at the window with Jonah's hand clamped in hers. The family arranged itself without discussion into a single straight line of stillness and eyes. The sleighs arrived with the soft hum of pads biting crust. They came in a shallow V and slid to a stop at a conversational distance. Kade Mercer rose in his saddle, tall in a coat that had never worked for its warmth. The smile he wore didn't reach his eyes. "Evening, Boon," he said. "You collect strays wherever you go, or is this a special winter?" "Roads will ice worse after dark," Elias said. "Say what you came to say and ride." "I'll say it plain. You bought rust and walls. You didn't buy them." Kade's gaze passed over Eliza and stayed a beat too long. "A woman and 3 mouths are a liability out here. Lane like this needs a man with pull. I take custody of the hub, see them fed and warm, keep wolves off. Simple trade." Silas's jaw clenched. "You are the wolves." Kade laughed softly and let it die on the air. "Brave. Unseasoned. I like him." He turned back to Elias. 70 credits doesn't make you king of a ruin." "Doesn't have to," Elias said. "Makes me a line." Kade's expression thinned. "Men who say protection usually mean possession. Then you won't mind proving me wrong somewhere else." Kade tipped his chin at the devices Elias had half buried. "What are those?" "Candles for the welcome mat." "Beacons," Elias said. "For when the weather forgets what it owes us." The nearest henchman leaned to squint. "Just a disc, boss." Elias thumbed a fob in his pocket. The discs burped a soft breath of current that you felt more than heard. The sleigh's stabilizers hiccuped, a small sag, a shiver. Not danger, exactly. Just the suggestion of it. Kade's mount drifted sideways half a handspan, and the animal under the machine stamped against the sensation. "Pretty toys," Kade said, voice flatter. "Shame if someone brought uglier ones." "You've mistaken empty for available," Elias said. Different words. The wind came up as if to underline it, rattling the busted sign over the tool depot, lifting a glitter of powder into the space between the men. On the porch, Eliza didn't flinch. She lifted her chin and set one hand on Jonah's shoulder through the doorframe and the other on Silas's sleeve. May's palm lay steady on Jonah's hair. The old town, which had spent years performing being dead, suddenly had the posture of a place that would remember this exact instant for a long time. Kade weighed stillness, their stillness, Elias's, the weather's, and then hawked a fleck of spit into the snow as if the valley were a stage he could dirty without consequence. "You'll regret this crossroads," he said, and raised 2 fingers. The sleighs eased backward, spun, and went soft into the white until even their hum had been swallowed. Elias stood until the last of the powder settled. When he turned, Eliza was already coming down the steps to meet him. Up close he could see the quick rise and fall of her breath. "Why didn't you push him?" she asked. "Because thunder invites thunder," he said. "And because we have work before we have war." She studied him, the way a person studies the shape of a word they are not yet ready to say aloud. Then she nodded once. They worked until the stars took the sky. The heater's duty cycle was too high, the exchanger burned hotter than was wise. Elias pulled the panel and soothed the old machine the way you soothe an animal that's been asked to do more than its share. Eliza handed him tools in a rhythm-like conversation, metal and glove and breath. Silas climbed the antenna mast to reset a guy line while the wind tested his footing with unfair questions. May inventoried seals, fingers moving like a miser who knows each coin by weight and sound. Jonah ferried fuel bricks and water with solemn speed, as if obeying orders hard enough could make the valley behave. When at last they closed the panel and the heater settled into a lower, saner voice, Elias straightened, put his hands on the small of his back, and let his gaze slide to the candle on the table. The biothermal flame was no bigger than a thumbnail and somehow managed to fill the room. "Thank you," Eliza said, and the words were as simple as a door opening and every bit as important. "Not between me and you," Elias said. "Between all of us." She looked at him for a long heartbeat, and this time she didn't look away first. Somewhere out in the white, the valley rearranged its weather to a new music. The night took the tracks Kade had left and blurred them into a nothing that looked exactly like peace. It wasn't. Before bed, Elias stepped outside, stood in the corridor, and listened. The cold pressed at his face like a question. He had planned to leave at spring shift. He caught himself making lists instead, parts he could machine from the hangar ribs, a filter housing worth salvaging, a way to brace the roof without begging the wind for approval. Inside, Eliza moved behind the curtain and paused as if she had felt his eyes. She lifted a hand. He lifted his. Between them the glass held the cold at bay and the gesture suspended. The heater exhaled and the town learned another way to be alive. Chapter 6, Bargaining with Winter. Morning broke hard and bright. The sky was a polished bone, the kind that meant temperature would fall faster than courage if you let it. They went up onto the roof with tethers clipped and tools leashed and humility in their knees. "The roof respects caution," Elias said, crouching low to seat a brace. "Copy," Eliza said behind him, and when she passed him the driver their gloves brushed. A pulse that had nothing to do with static lived an instant along his palm. Silas called from the eave, guy wires tight, and Elias turned just enough to see the boy's mouth pinched against the cold and something else. Pride, maybe. Or fear trying on the shape of responsibility and finding it fit. They worked the rotation Eliza set, 2 minutes out, 2 minutes in, hot hands on a mug between laps. May counted aloud to keep them honest and to keep her own breath even. Jonah named the sleigh when no one was listening, Pepper, and stroked its nose cone as if the machine could feel affection through carbon skin. By mid-morning, a crust of rime had turned the mast into a flute that sang when the wind kissed it wrong. Elias lashed a drift shield against its base and felt the line settle. Back inside, he bled heat off the exchanger before it could eat itself and wired a microfission starter as a backup, a square little box that sat on the floor and looked too unassuming for the power it promised. "You talk to machines," Eliza said, watching him coax an obstinate valve into cooperation. "Like they're old horses." "Old horses listen," he said. "If you remember who was there first." She smiled at the floor, a private thing. At noon, he taught Jonah to tie a safety loop that didn't slip if you begged it to. The boy's tongue stuck out the side of his mouth with concentration. "If you forget the last tuck," Elias said, "the knot pretends to know you. Then it proves it doesn't." "I won't forget," Jonah said, and it sounded like a promise to someone older than himself. He showed May the radio's innards, the dusty miracle of circuits that still worked after years of weather trying to make them stop. "You route your voice through here," he said, "and if the sky's in a mood to listen, it carries it farther than legs can go." "What would I say?" May asked. "Start with the weather," Eliza said from the heater. "And when you're done with that, say what you wish someone had told you yesterday." May nodded as if she'd been given a new chore and a secret at the same time. The day wore into the kind of afternoon that looks like evening if you stare too long. The wind picked up tricks. Gusts reached down the corridor and tried to flip panels like cards. A sheet of roofing went up with a shout and tried to fly. Eliza lunged after it, tether taut, feet sliding. Elias didn't think. He caught her by the waist and the line dragged them both to the lip before it snapped them back, two bodies pinned together for a breath too close and too much. They froze there, faces inches apart, the cold a ring of teeth around their brief, accidental heat. "Don't apologize," she whispered. "I wasn't going to," he said, voice rough. "I was going to tell you to let the roof be a roof and you be you." Her mouth tilted. "Consider me told." They got the panel seated and bolted without losing skin or temper. When they dropped back through the hatch, Silas's eyes were on Elias's hand where it had rested a beat too long on the rung. The boy's expression held the complicated knot of a son noticing something about his mother and the man the winter had sent to their door. After dusk, when tools were hung and the day's sweat had turned to salt in their clothes, they ate stew so thin it barely qualified and made it a meal by pretending hard. Jonah rolled the rock candy between his fingers before putting it back in his pocket for later being a territory he was learning to trust again. "Why did you come here?" Silas asked across the steam. "To strip steel," Elias said, and then, because he felt the line in the room shift under his feet, he added, "and because all my roads have begun to feel like detours." Silas considered that, and this time when he looked at his mother for translation, she didn't offer any. He would have to carry the sentence himself. The second night of the cold snap pressed its face against the windows and stayed there, fogging the glass as if it were a living thing with opinions. Elias lit the candle Eliza had given him and set it on the table. The flame lifted, small and stubborn. Across from it, Eliza's needle moved through cloth with a grace that made a mockery of exhaustion. "Thank you," she said again, looking not at the candle but at him. "For what?" he asked. "For choosing to stand where you could have kept walking." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The choice was all over the room, in the repaired latch and the comforter that no longer leaked feathers and the boys' hands that tied knots with confidence they hadn't owned yesterday. Near midnight, the wind shifted. Not louder, different. Elias went to the door, opened it a crack, and stood with his head tilted the way you do when you're listening to a language you used to know. "What is it?" Eliza asked behind him. "The valley," he said. "It's changing keys." Out beyond the last module, the horizon wore a smudge that didn't belong to weather. He stepped into the cold and let it chew his breath while his eyes learned the shape in the dark. Grav pads write their own grammar in snow, faint hollows inside a shine. He knelt at the edge of the corridor and touched the top of a drift. The indentation was new enough to hold the memory of weight. "Company?" Eliza's voice was steady. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe just ghosts riding the lanes." They stood shoulder to shoulder in the door and watched the night draw its veil. The candle burned behind them, painting their shadows long and joined on the floorboards. In the quiet, the town's old bones stopped sounding like a ruin and started sounding like a thing that had decided to try again. At the edge of the flats, a darker darkness moved and then stilled, as if something had changed its mind or been told to wait. Elias closed the door softly. He checked the braces by habit and then checked them again because habit is a way to calm hands. Eliza sat and wound thread back onto a small, careful spool. Silas leaned his shoulder against the wall just close enough to be counted. May gathered Jonah's cards and stacked them square. "Sleep if you can," Elias said. "We can," Eliza said, and it felt like a promise that belonged to all of them. Outside, the wind kept its opinions. On the table the candle held a small circle of warmth as if it had been born to defy mathematics. Somewhere beyond the last of the town's modules, machines waited in the white, counting their own reasons. Morning would come blue and brittle. With it, the storm would raise its voice another notch, and decisions that had been words would have to become actions. The valley liked to erase tracks. But some lines you draw stay, even when snow pretends they don't. Chapter 7, When the Snow Spoke. The storm arrived with intention. It didn't gallop in or smash the valley flat, it tightened around Gale Cradle like a fist learning how to make itself useful. The wind dropped its pitch to a grind that lived in the ribs of the modules. Snow came not as flakes but as a texture, the air itself turning granular, a white that carried weight. They were ready as far as readiness ever counts. The mast was guyed, the roof braced, the exchanger cooled and coupled to the microfission starter that hummed like a cat daring you to doubt it. The candle on the table burned small and steady, a punctuation mark holding a sentence together. At first dark, May's voice slipped soft through the repaired radio, testing ranges. Gale Cradle weather, wind steady from west, barometer falling, visibility poor. If anyone else is out there, keep your rigs low and your hopes higher. She said it, then ducked her head like someone who had said a true thing out loud for the first time. Silas stood in the doorway and scanned the corridor without blinking, as if blinking would be the thing the storm was waiting for. "Nothing," he said. Then, something. Grav pads don't have hooves, but they announce themselves to snow in a language as old, hollow lines in the crust, a faint tremor in drift that has nothing to do with wind. Elias felt it beneath his boots before he heard anything. He stepped out into the corridor with his collar high and his tether clipped. They came low, 3 across and 1 back, lights hooded, rigs trimmed to the edge of control. Kade in front again, his coat hood furred and beating ice, 2 men to his flanks and another trailing short like a dog that had learned caution. The storm wrapped them generous, the pads threw out halos of disturbed snow that looked like broken crowns. Kade raised a hand and the sleighs angled to a stop just beyond the reflector plates Elias had seated earlier. The men moved in their saddles as if the air were thicker than it used to be. "You left your porch light on," Kade called, voice even. "Thought we'd visit." "You didn't think about the weather," Elias said. Kade smiled with 2 teeth less than humor. "Weather doesn't think about me, either." Eliza stepped onto the porch and stood with her shoulder almost touching Silas. May drew Jonah back from the window but didn't hide him. The family made that same line they had made before, the one that had turned the town into a place that could say no. "This is that part," Kade said, "where we all rehearse our lines about deeds and boundaries and who deserves what. I'm cold. Skip to the part where you hand over the keys." Elias thumbed the fob once. The discs in the snow gave a small, polite cough that the storm pretended not to hear. The sleighs shivered. "You'll break your rigs if you push into the corridor," Elias said. "The wind funnels here and chews at your stabilizers. You can't see the eddies, I can." "Because you planted them," Kade said, eye narrowing. "Neat trick, Boon. You learn that hauling or running away from better men." "I learned it leaving places that stopped being worth staying," Elias said. "This one hasn't." Kade flicked 2 fingers. The flanker to his left jerked his chin up, impatient, and leaned on his throttle. The sleigh jumped, bit crosswind and let the wind bite back. It slewed sideways and planted a ski hard into a low drift. The drift wasn't a drift, it was a shallow trench Elias had scooped and covered hours earlier. The sleigh's nose kissed empty air, the tail bit, and the whole rig did a slow, surprised tilt. Elias had already moved. He didn't think about timing, his hands had learned the path. He keyed the field puck at his belt and flung it with a roll of wrist that had once thrown ropes on rocks in other winters. The puck bloomed a shield wide enough for a man and a mistake. The sleigh's nose smacked the shimmer, skated, and dropped back onto the snow with a graceless thump instead of digging in and breaking a man's neck in front of his friends. The flanker jolted in the saddle and shot Elias a look that had fear in it and, underneath, the beginning of respect he didn't want to have. "Don't," Elias said. It wasn't a threat. It was a request a teacher makes of a child about to test an outlet with a fork. Kade's smile didn't change, but something about its bones did. "He saves our skins and thinks it buys him gratitude," he said to the storm. "Boys, stop admiring his good deeds." The second flanker eased left, trying to skirt the trench and the plates both. Silas moved. He didn't ask permission. He flung the coil line Elias had taught him to throw 2 days earlier, overhand, with the last tuck so the loop didn't lie. The line snapped around the sleigh's upright and yanked with a force out of proportion to the boy who had thrown it. The sleigh lurched, and the rider swore and let go of his sidearm to grab for the rail instead. Eliza had Jonah behind her knees by then. May stood with both hands on the doorframe as if she could hold the house in place if the valley tried to tug it away. Her lips moved, counting breaths, counting pulses, or reciting the radio checks she had memorized. The heater's voice came low and strong from behind them, the microfission unit thrumming approval like a father clearing his throat. Kade slid his rig a meter forward, testing. The pad stuttered where Elias had thrown a second, more delicate veil, just enough noise to make a machine question its own readings. Last time, Elias said. Turn out. Let the storm end. Come back at noon on a clear day if you're still convinced you want to be unwelcome. You think weather is your ally, Kade said. It was eating this place long before you slung rope. I think weather listens to anyone who bothers to learn its grammar, Elias said. Kade's mouth thinned to a straight, careful line. He nodded once to his trailing man. The trailing man raised a compact weapon and sighted on Silas, who stood a half step ahead of his mother, young and stubborn and one mistake from the kind of learning you don't outlive. Eliza said, no, in a voice that had the heft of 1,000 small refusals behind it. Elias didn't draw. He didn't have to. He lifted his field puck like a man showing a coin trick and fanned its charge into a shield that stretched, ridiculously, beautifully, wide enough to cover the boy, the woman, and the space the storm had been keeping for absence. The shot cracked and met the shimmer and fell as harmless light in the snow, where it fizzed like a firework embarrassed to be seen in daylight. Silas didn't waste the distraction. He yanked the line, the sleigh spun, the rider slewed, and the weapon slipped out of a glove that had sweat in it now and went skittering across the crust to stop at Jonah's feet. Jonah stared at it with the solemn, horrified fascination of a child looking at a snake that has decided not to strike. Kick it back, Eliza said, and the boy did, hard enough to send it under the porch where snow kept secrets. The wind rose. It didn't like steel pointed at lines that had been drawn clean. It rushed down the corridor and lifted powder into a wall that stood up between the sleighs and the porch. In that moment of muttered white, Kade made his decision. He jerked his rig around like a man choosing not to die that day. You'll choke on this kindness, he said through his teeth, and then, louder, to his men, out. Out. They tried to leave neat. The storm wanted messy. One sleigh caught the edge of the trench and bucked. Another fought a crossgust and nearly spun. Kade carved a line that was more skill than luck and punched through into the wider white beyond the town's mouth. The others followed him like scents late to a fight. Their hum faded, swallowed by the animal sitting on the valley. Elias stood until the air in front of him steadied. The shield fell with a sigh. His hands shook once, a private thing. Silas blew out a breath he had forgotten to take. May made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost a sob and became neither. Jonah took his hand out of his pocket and looked surprised to find the rock candy still there. Eliza stepped down into the snow, crossed the distance, and touched the cut on Elias's cheek with 2 fingers as if repairs could be made to a man the same way you make them to a roof. Thank you, she said. The words were as practical as bolts, they held things. Not between me and you, he said. Between us and what wants to own us. Her eyes met his. She didn't look away. They went inside as the storm took a breath to consider what kind of world it wanted to be. The heater settled. The candle held. Outside, the tracks of the sleighs blurred and went to nothing. Inside, the line stayed. That night they slept like people who have learned, for one more day, how to teach winter a lesson. Chapter 8, Candlelight in the White. After a long fury, weather often leaves a quiet so complete it feels like a missing tooth. The morning broke on a valley rubbed smooth, every ugly thing softened by a mercy you didn't ask for. The mast stood, crooked, stubborn, a drunk old uncle who had kept his promise. The roof held. The exchanger ticked its gratitude for attention well given. They moved through the rooms like owners. Not owners by deed, though Elias had that folded in his pocket like a joke that had learned better manners, but by the right that work confers when work is done with care. The kitchen looked less like a relic and more like a place that knew what to do with steam. The window latch held its seat. The draft under the door had lost most of its argument. Elias pulled the mast calibrations while Silas steadied the ladder and pretended not to watch his mother watching Elias's hands. May laid a neat row of candles on the sill and gave each a name she didn't say out loud, then checked the radio again, voice steadier now that the valley had proven it could listen. Gale cradle calling out, sky clear and cold, visibility long, air tastes like pennies. "If you're on the lanes, keep it kind," she said, and smiled, shy of the microphone and bold of the world. Jonah sat by the sleigh and learned the pre-flight checklist as if the machine had decided it would consent to be a pony today. "Pepper," he said to the nose cone, and it felt less ridiculous this morning than last night. They inventoried damage the way you inventory old regrets, honest, thorough, with an eye toward what can be mended and what must be let go. The antenna needed a new bracket. Elias could mill one from a beam in the hangar. The east wall wanted a brace and a promise. The fuel stack was thinner than anyone liked to say. They made lists and then made a stew that pretended to be more than it was and mostly succeeded because when you eat together, soup stands taller in the bowl. In the afternoon, sunlight found its courage. It laid long bars on the corridor and turned the drifts into fields of mica. Elias and Eliza stepped outside with mugs and stood at the edge of the porch. Not touching. Not needing to. "When spring shift comes," he said, and the words felt like a dangerous luxury, "we can rig hydroponics in the hangar. Run the exchanger lean and let the sun do its share. Grow something that tastes like more than surviving." Eliza looked at the plane of white that had been trying to convince them there was no such thing as later. "I'd like that," she said. He turned his mug in his hands. "I can go to the waypost regular. Bring back what's worth bringing. If we wire the radio to the mast and call clean, someone will answer. Might take time. But lanes don't stay empty. Not forever." "Lanes don't," she said. "People do. Unless they decide not to." He watched her profile against the light that made everything look honest. "I'm deciding not to," he said. She let out a breath that turned to a ribbon and drifted, the softest banner any army ever carried. "Then we make a place worth choosing." He might have reached for her hand then. He didn't need to, because a different sound pulled both their faces to the sky at once, the faraway thrum of engines coupled to a hull too big to ignore. Not Kade. Too high, too legal. A trader, or a registry ship slumming righteousness, or just a captain with a map and a need. May came to the door with the microphone and an expression like a bird that had just remembered how to be wings. "Do I call?" she asked. "Call," Eliza said. "Gale cradle to any friendly ears," May said, voice threading the air with a steadiness she had borrowed from weather and family. "We held through the blow. We're here." Static answered, then a crackle with narrative ambitions. "Adel, this is Shuttle Branta out of Sister's Gate. Read you faint but fair. Are you a functioning hub?" May looked at her mother, at Elias, at the candle on the table burning like hope raised to the power of small things. "We are," she said into the mic, "we are now." The reply came with a laugh in it, tired, relieved, human. "Copy, Gale Cradle. Bringing you a neighborly circle. Prepare to point us at your flat spot." Elias moved without meaning to. He stepped into the corridor and lifted a hand as if the ship could see a man saying yes. Eliza stepped beside him and matched the gesture. Silas came to stand at Elias's other side and did not pretend it was anything other than what it was. May kept talking to the sky. Jonah pressed his palm to Pepper's skin and whispered the last line of the checklist like a prayer. The ship grew from rumor to silhouette to shape, a dull shine moving slow and confident. It circled once, sending a spill of sun through its wake that fell like coins on the town. Then it banked to the flats and flared for a landing piecewise and polite, the way you enter a room you intend to be invited back to. "Neighbors," Eliza said, tasting the word. "Neighbors," Elias said, agreeing to it. They watched the ship settle in a glitter of frost. They could count the decisions ahead like weathers, who to barter with, what lines to keep bright, how to keep a family when the world starts talking, and the loneliness that had been a shelter learns how to be porous. The kind of problems you are allowed to have when you choose to live. That night, after the ship had traded news for news and sugar for seals and rumor for names, after lights winked off along the corridor one by one like a town deciding on sleep, Elias lit the candle Eliza had given him and set it on the table. The flame reached up, a little taller than before. He looked at her. She looked at him. Nothing in the room needed to be said, and so everything was true. Outside, Whitefall breathed a slow, cold breath and let it go. Inside, the town held a warmth you could feel in your hands. Some winters, a man doesn't just endure. He chooses who he endures them with, and in that choosing, winter learns its place. Elias blew out the candle, and the dark came easy, like a friend finding its chair again. Then, because stories like this travel on shared fires, he turned to camera and murmured, as if inviting listeners to help keep Gale Cradle's lights burning, "If this line in the snow felt like your kind of frontier, tap like, subscribe to Sci-Fi Nebula, and drop us a quick comment about the moment you'd have stood your ground."